Wonderful. Let's start. Welcome to our this is seventh seminar, week 7. We have another one for our European Studies Center seminar series this term, and it's a wonderful pleasure to have Sonia present to us her work. Sonia Giebel is our Dahrendorf fellow, and she's the third in a row. In a line of very, very good fellows. So you're continuing our tradition. And she does her work on diversity in higher education, which is what she will be talking to us today. She did change the title from what it was in the program, checking multiple boxes, defining diversity in global higher education. She has written extensively on this topic. And she has a great background with a PhD from Stanford University and a BA from Haverford College, and at the same time having published as well on this particular topic in various academic journals, including Sociology of Education, Science Advances, and so on and so forth. So we're looking forward to listening to your presentation. Of course, we did invite David Johnston because he is our foremost expert in this college and the university on these matters. And we're really grateful, David, for being with us on this today. And I'm sure that Sonia will definitely benefit from your feedback on her work. Over to you.
Thank you, Othon, for that very generous introduction. Thank you in advance, Professor Johnston, for your comments, which I'm sure will be very helpful. And I want to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon and joining me this afternoon. And I do not take for granted that you are making this decision on a very beautiful spring day. So I know the opportunity cost, to speak like an economist, was especially high. But I'm very chuffed to be able to have the opportunity to present my work. Let's see. Which, as Othon noted, I've changed the title. I've been a bad presenter to checking multiple boxes, defining diversity in global higher education. I also want to thank everyone for joining me today because I know that I am not as common of a presenter here at the ESC to be both a sociologist and an education scholar who does not solely focus on Europe. So I am looking forward to hopefully what will be a very productive discussion that I hope will resonate with all of you. Seeing as we all occupy higher education in some form or fashion. So I thought to start us off, I would begin with the local example. Where am I? Oh, here we go. Okay, sorry. So I wanted to open with a local example of the kind of definition or lack thereof of diversity. Does anyone recognize this woman? Might be for the best, if not. Okay. So this is Mackenzie Fierstead. She was awarded the Rhodes Fellowship to study here at Oxford in 2021 from the University of Pennsylvania. For those of you who are not familiar with the Rhodes Scholarship, it is one of the most prestigious scholarships that one can win. It affords 4 years of study here at Oxford, all expenses paid. And it's a huge individual honor as well as an honor for the university. So in keeping with the prestige of this award, the University of Pennsylvania released this article about Mackenzie, and therein they described her multiple times and referred to different dimensions of her identity. So you'll see here, they talk about her being a former foster youth, a queer first-generation low-income student who works to uplift the communities that she represents through her academic, professional, and personal pursuits. Again, they talk about this in another part of the, sorry, I'm really not very good at pointing here. In another part of the article, again, emphasizing her first-generation college status, her low-income status, and that she's been a member or been through the foster system in the United States. And this is true. This was really important to the way that Mackenzie crafted her application. She talked about her own experiences in the foster system. She very much identified as a first-generation low-income student. And that was really the crux of her intellectual aspirations here. She wanted to study the youth-centered community organizing work, and as she describes, the foster care to prison pipeline. So I'm just curious, by a show of hands, how many of you, based off of how Penn has described Mackenzie and how she has described her experiences, would think of Mackenzie as contributing to diversity at the University of Pennsylvania and also here at Oxford? So most everyone. I see some more tepid hands in the background, but we're close to consensus here. Now, this was a very inspiring story. There was lots of fanfare around it. And then things became a little bit more complicated around Mackenzie's story. So what if I told you that Mackenzie's mother is a radiologist, so she has a medical background and an undergraduate degree, and that Mackenzie attended a private high school in St. Louis that typically costs around $30,000 a year, and grew up in a very middle-class neighborhood in a very nice home? How many of you now think that she might contribute to diversity here at Oxford or at the University of Pennsylvania? Yes, I still see some hands. Good. Okay. I'm curious, actually, if I may interrupt. I'm curious why.
Okay, you didn't negate all the things that would give her this diversity, like, for example, being gay.
Okay, so because maybe some of the other dimensions of identity.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. I'm glad that I asked. So we'll talk about some of those things. So this created a real firestorm, and it made it here to the UK as well. This is a snippet from the Daily Mail. She ended up actually losing her Rhodes Scholarship and entered into a very protracted legal battle with the University of Pennsylvania about whether she had misrepresented her identity in her application materials, even to the University of Pennsylvania as well. Now, I am purposefully showcasing the drama and the controversy around this article, or around this Rhodes Fellowship. But I want to draw your attention to this because it's actually a little bit more complicated of a story than at least how this article has presented it, and as I am guilty of presenting it as well. And that's because of how Penn itself defines first-generation college students. So they offer here 4 different criteria for how they themselves, to this day, define the term first-generation college student. So they include the one or more of your parents had not completed their bachelor's degree at the time of enrollment, or if that individual took more than 6 years. They count individuals whose parents or guardians completed their bachelor's degrees outside of the United States. So for any of you who maybe have an Oxbridge degree and their partner has an Oxbridge degree, should your child choose to apply to the University of Pennsylvania, it would be counted as a first-generation college student. If you're the first person in your family to attend a research university with the resources and opportunities that Penn education provides, then you are also counted as a first-generation college student. You'll notice here again the ambiguity around what a Penn education really is. Maybe one presumes, having gone to Harvard University or Cornell University, fellow Ivy League universities are comparable. But what about someone who went to the University of Washington or the University of Texas at Austin, or like Paul and I went to a small liberal arts college like Haverford College? Are our children now going to be first-generation college students? And the real crux of this in Mackenzie's case was this 4th bullet point, which is that they also count someone as a first-generation college student if they have a strained or a limited relationship with the parent in the family who holds a bachelor's degree. And that was the crux of Mackenzie's case. Her mother had been very abusive to her growing up, and so when she was 17, she was granted emancipation and therefore entered the foster system. She applied to college without the financial or emotional support from her mother. She entered through a program that was specifically allocated for low-income first-generation youth called Questbridge. And so Penn identified her, based off of their own definitions, as a first-generation college student, and that's how she was treated throughout her entire time at Penn as well. So now I want to ask one more time, based off of these definitions, do you think Mackenzie contributes to diversity at Penn and at Oxford? We still yes?
Yeah. That's what I said before.
Yeah.
But I also think that if you chose black, it's not going to work. What these other things, still be very marketing.
Okay, we'll get to that.
Okay.
But I open, you might be asking, so why did I open with this example? Well, I want to show you that the definition and boundaries of diversity are really, really very vague. They're very open to interpretation, and I want to argue throughout this talk that that's actually by design. We'll talk about some of the affordances and the vulnerabilities that come with that kind of vagueness of diversity. But I also want to show how these, the kind of vagueness of these diversity boundaries mean that diversity can kind of expand or contract to accommodate different groups and different identities. And the expansion and contraction is a process that's kind of formed between organizational pressures, so what the university is interested in, as well as individual interpretation. And I'm going to show you a couple of different instantiations of that kind of negotiation of diversity across nations and both within nations. And to plant a seed for discussion at the end of our time together, I want you to think about if diversity's lack of definition is a strength or a vulnerability. So I want to explore this kind of expansion and contraction of diversity in two different national contexts. I want to think about it in the context of the United States, which is undergoing rapid demographic change, as is the UK, especially in the growth of the multiracial demographic. And as if you've been scanning headlines, is also currently in the throes of very fierce political debate around diversity, and especially its relationship to excellence, or what diversity is really achieving, the fairness of diversity. And in that case, I'm going to be talking about the contestation of group membership. What are the boundaries of diversity categories and who belongs in one category versus another? And I want to talk about it in the context of Germany, which is currently really seeking global prominence in the broader higher education ecosystem, and where diversity discourse is very nascent. It's very much under construction. It's very new, especially in relationship to diversity discourse here in the UK and in the United States. And there I want to be talking about the contestation of categories that comprise diversity. So when you were talking about which forms of identity count, there that is very much the topic of discussion in the German context. So without further ado, I'd like to talk a little bit about that German context, and it's through a working paper called Diversity in an Age of Global Ambition, the case of German excellence universities, that is in collaboration, with my fabulous research intern, Charlotte Nürnberg, who's at the Free University of Berlin, as well as my postdoc advisor, Yasmin Soysal, who is still in Berlin at the Social Science Center. Now, German universities are part of the European Higher Education Association, and so they are ruled by what's known as the Bologna process. So that facilitates the smooth transfer of students in Germany being able to pursue higher education in France or in Switzerland and vice versa. So they are also subject to the terms that are laid out by the Bologna process. And in 2018, so again, fairly recently, the Bologna process stipulated the following. In order to meet our commitment that the student body entering and graduating from European higher education institutions reflects the diversity of Europe's populations, we will improve access and completion by underrepresented and vulnerable groups. Now, again, here, this terminology of underrepresented and vulnerable groups is very much open to interpretation. And the European Higher Education Association comprises a number of different nations who might all define underrepresented and vulnerable groups differently. So what's Germany's definition of this term? So historically, their focus has really been on gender parity. So women would be synonymous with an underrepresented and vulnerable. So to them, Mackenzie Fierstein, no question. As a woman, she is part of an underrepresented group. And why is that? Well, it's part of a robust, established tradition of trying to what they call mainstream gender equality efforts in German higher education. So almost every university that you encounter in Germany will have a gender equality office and a gender equality officer. They sit in on faculty hiring committees, for example, and that has really been the kind of main pillar of how inclusion efforts in Germany have manifested. This is also for good reason. When we compare Germany to some of its peers, its performance in terms of women's enrollment in higher education is still relatively lagging. So just as one metric, now women did finally reach parity and actually just eclipse men's enrollment in German higher education, but that was just last year in the 2023-2024 academic year. If you compare it to the UK and the US, they accomplished that metric in the early 2000s. I believe it was 2001 and 2003. So there is a full 2-decade gap there in terms of women's representation in German higher education. And efforts to introduce diversity offices in the last decade or so have really been met with skepticism. And that's for a couple of different reasons. So first is there's not really a very clear definition of what a diversity office in Germany is supposed to be doing. Is it supposed to be alongside, or is it supposed to be in competition with gender parity efforts? So there is some skepticism from gender equality officers that the emergence of a diversity office might actually pull resources from gender equality efforts that are still very much needed. People also really don't know who diversity offices are supposed to refer to. So gender parity has a very clear target in women. Diversity offices, it's very unclear as to who they should actually be recruiting or who they should be serving. This is also very important in the context of Germany because of its specific histories and cultural norms. So the documentation of social difference in Germany is seen as quite threatening. And like other European continental countries, I should say, the idea of race and ethnicity is very much rejected. They think that is something that is coming from the United States. They sometimes think that that is something that Hitler introduced to the country, and the social categorization and classification of difference is seen with a lot of trepidation and fear because of the history of genocide. So there's a kind of a real forceful resistance to the adoption of diversity offices in Germany and the definition of diversity, beyond women. So what might compel German universities to change their tune? I want to suggest that academic rankings are one venue that will compel or that could compel German universities to rethink how they define diversity. So global rankings started in the early 2000s. The very first was the academic ranking of world universities. These are otherwise known as the Shanghai rankings. Those were introduced in 2003. And the Times Higher Education rankings, those are the British version, were introduced the year after in 2004. Now, the history of German higher education is very storied. You can think of great thinkers that have come out of the German higher education system. Research universities in the United States were modeled after the German higher education system. So there's a real sense of legitimacy in German higher education. And when these rankings came out, to the chagrin of many German academics and the German higher education system, there were no German universities that appeared in the top 100 ranks of either of those global rankings, which is quite an indictment of the higher education system. So in 2006, not long thereafter, and I would argue not coincidentally, the introduction of the Excellence Initiative, was introduced in Germany. And this really broke with the much more egalitarian history of German higher education. German higher education really prided itself on a lack of stratification in its higher education system. If you attended Heidelberg University or Humboldt, you should really be getting a comparable product, so to speak. Admission rates were the same, admission and tuition rates were the same. But with the introduction of the excellence initiatives, specific universities were really marked as kind of the elite or the hallmark universities, akin to the Russell Group here in the UK or the Ivy League or Ivy Plus in the US. These universities received additional funding. This was to hopefully increase their research output, the awards that they could be in contention for or garner. Those are the kind of core metrics that feed into the Times Higher Education rankings or other global rankings. And the real impetus or the real goal underlying all of this was to increase competition and raise the global profile of German higher education. So this already in the early 2000s and continuing into the 2010s represented a real shift in the kind of orientation and goal setting of German higher education. Now, what does that do? What does competition do? So if I lean on my organizational sociologist here, we know that rankings don't function as what McKenzie calls a camera, but rather as an engine. So that is to say that they don't just capture relative performance, how University A is doing relative to University B, but that the rankings themselves actually spur organizational behavior and change. So it can change the way that universities think about their admission policies in the admission of first-generation college students or the admission of law students as they are orienting towards how rankings are being assessed. It also spurs the adoption of more globally recognized policies so that universities that are maybe not as high ranked become more legible, appear more like their higher ranked peers. This is what sociologists call mimetic isomorphism or the emulation of higher ranked universities. So this is kind of a keeping up with the Joneses idea. If you want to play like, or if you want to beat them, you want to compete with them, you need to act. So I want to argue that at the current moment, German excellence universities are at a bit of a crossroads in terms of how they want to define diversity. So on the one hand, in relationship to this need to compete, or this desire and ambition to compete in the global higher education rankings, one might expect that they would adopt, under institutional pressures, adapt to some of these behaviors of higher ranked actors. I'll show you this in a moment, but many of you, I assume, can probably guess who the top ranking universities are in those global rankings. That would mean that Germany would need to expand their definition of diversity beyond just gender equality and start to mirror the discourse of some of the higher ranked actors. And think about how Oxford might define diversity and whether Germany is starting to mimic how Oxford is thinking. But on the other hand, based off of what I talked about earlier, they could also choose to retain their emphasis on gender equality and instead have a kind of shallow or more symbolic introduction of diversity, really alongside more established gender equality efforts. And that would really be kind of the path of least resistance if we think about this, but it would also be in line with the more resistance to documentation of social difference, and to kind of sidestep any frictions between gender equality offices and diversity offices, which are already kind of similar. So I want to test and see or offer a snapshot of which of these two paths German universities seem to be more inclined to follow at the moment. So I apologize, this is a little bit smaller or hard to see here as I'm seeing on the screen, but to the left, you'll see the full list of German excellence universities. To the right, you see the top 10 ranking universities in the most recent edition of the Times Higher Education ranks. So you'll see Oxford is listed at number 1. Cambridge and Imperial College London also represent the UK. And then the rest are Ivy League or Ivy Plus universities in the United States. So we're working here with a predominantly Western and Anglo-Saxon understanding of diversity discourse. And my aim here is to really compare how these diversity discourses in Germany compare to these top-ranking universities. To do that, I scraped the publicly available text from diversity websites of both the German excellence universities as well as the top 10 Times Higher Education universities. And I choose to look at how they are representing their commitments to diversity and their definitions of diversity because websites are where universities primarily engage in reputation management, where they signal their commitments and their values, both to prospective students as well as to one another. And I computationally analyze this text data, and you'll see the exhibits that I'm about to show you are really aimed at showing broad patterning and high-level distinctions. And I'm really focused here at identifying the kind of core pillars and features of each text corpus's diversity. So do I see the emergence of other identities beyond women in the German context, for example? I'm very curious to see how this, we have one more time, getting ahead of myself. So just to give you an example of the kind of text that I'm collecting for this project, I'm showing 2 different snippets here. The top is a snippet from Princeton and how they're defining diversity on their kind of main diversity page. I imagine it's rather hard for you to see this. Maybe you see it a little bit easier than I do. But here they talk about race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion, socioeconomic status, and I think that might be it. But they were listing kind of myriad different dimensions of diversity. And then the bottom is a snippet from Heidelberg University, which does mention other things beyond gender or sex. They also mention age, religion, or origin. And they also note the compatibility of professional work and family life. So these are the types of texts that I'm analyzing, and the computational methods are to analyze these texts at scale, really looking at kind of key distinctions between the 2 text corpora. So I'll start with trying to show a baseline, and I know that these are very difficult to read. I will walk you through them, of the kind of text relation or the semantic relationships between the words that are embedded in this text. So this is for the Times Higher Education university network or university corpus here. And this is officially it's called the frequency co-occurrence matrix network plot, which no one should try and remember. You can think of it as a spaghetti plot. But what this is doing is showing the kind of semantic connections between words. So I'm going to see if you can see this, but I'll walk you through this. So essentially, Do I have that? Yeah. So in those kind of central terms here, you have words like equity, diversity, inclusion, so some of the more kind of core terms around diversity. And the idea here is that every blue line between one word and another represents a co-occurrence. So those words are in the same sentence, for example, or in the same two sentences, so they're co-occurring, so to speak. So you can see the more central or the more lines are connecting these different words, the more central that term is to diversity. So I'm looking both at kind of the location of the terms, but I'm also looking specifically at which terms emerge in these diversity plot or in these network plots as in terms of the different identity dimensions that might be related to diversity. So this is kind of a visualization of how one is defining diversity in the Times higher education context. So just to walk you through this very quickly. So here we see LGBTQ, we see sexual misconduct, excuse me, and we see pregnancy and childbirth. So those are all kind of related. Oh, and non-binary, that was the other one. So here we see kind of references to gender, sexuality. We also see some references to women that we might expect in the German context as well. But we also see some aspects of identity around race, indigeneity, land acknowledgement, racial again, that is much more specific or much more recognizable in the UK and in the US context. You'll also see I mentioned a number of different types of diversities here, so you can think about the kind of much more broad, capacious definition of diversity and the types of identities that might be included. So this is to contrast here, this is the German Excellence Universities plot. And again, I apologize, this is harder to read than I realized. But I will point you through again the kind of core terms. So here, this is gender equality and this is gender. You can see how centrally these are located here. In this plot, you also see the emergence of family and family friendliness. So that echoes what was already present in that clip that I showed from Heidelberg. And you don't see any other dimensions of diversity. This here is Professorenforum, which I included because of the specificity of the German language, that it's actually a reference to women professors. So again, a kind of instantiation of gender as a kind of primary axis of diversity here in Germany. So at least at this kind of computational level, we're seeing a real reliance of gender equality as a kind of primary axis of diversity in Germany. And just to substantiate this a little bit further, I also ran what's called the Keenest plot. And this is looking at the relative frequency of words in one corpus relative to another. So the words listed in blue are the terms that are much more likely to occur in the German context relative to the UK and US, and vice versa in gray. So these are not to say that the terms in blue only show up in the German corpus, or that the terms in gray only show up in the UK corpus, but that the terms in blue are much more likely, because of their frequency, to emerge in the German context than the UK context. So here in the UK context, we see again LGBTQ and race. So that's signaling both the frequency of those occurrences in the UK context and the absence of them, or the relative absence of them in the German case. But here again, we see here gender equality, and then way up here at the top, this is one of the most, the highest keenness values here is around family. So again, we see kind of more evidence around the kind of emphasis on gender equality in the German context, rather than a much more elaborate understanding of diversity. So to take you back to this crossroads that I first opened with, and whether German excellence universities might be adopting a more expansive understanding of diversity as they seek more global prominence, or whether they would retain an emphasis on gender equality, at least computationally, we see much more support for the second pathway, that there seems to be this adoption, this maintenance of gender equality as the primary axis of diversity. We've also done some qualitative analyses of those text snippets, so I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. But just at a very high level, from a computational perspective, we see actually a real persistence of gender as the kind of primary axis of diversity in Germany. So based off of this case, I want to make a note that first, universities, yes, they are subject to global or regional pressures to adopt diversity. We can recall again that concept or the stipulation from the Bologna process, but the ambiguity of diversity and how we define a group or a term like underrepresented group or vulnerable group allows for the manifestation of nationally distinctive ideas of diversity or representation of diversity. And while universities are definitely responsive to international competition, we can think about the Excellence Initiative as an example of that. Universities are also likely to take the path of least resistance to meet those global expectations. So they rely on what is already there, and then think about how to kind of adjust to accommodate some of those features. So I talked about the German case because of the kind of dynamic nature, the kind of nascent nature of diversity here, and the inclusion of which types of identities are relevant for diversity. I'm going to shift now to talk about, and I've talked about this at the organizational level, so how universities themselves are defining diversity. I'm going to shift now to talk about a different kind of ambiguity around diversity, and that's around individual identities that don't comport with the predominant classification schemes. And to talk about that, I'm going to go to the United States, which is currently navigating a number of different legal and cultural controversies around diversity and affirmative action. And I want to focus on multiracial individuals, so those who identify with multiple race categories, and how they might comport or not with diversity schemas in the United States. This is work from my ongoing book project, Diversity in Pieces, The Fall and Future of Affirmative Action in Multiracial America. This book project is set in the wake, or I should say in the days of the years leading up to the fall of affirmative action. So as you hear me talk about this project, I'm going to talk about affirmative action as if it were still legal, because it was for my participants when I was interviewing them. But in 2023, the Supreme Court officially struck down the legality or constitutionality of race-based affirmative action in the United States. That means that colleges can no longer consider an applicant's race, at least via a checkbox in their evaluation and ultimate admissions decisions. So we are working in the aftermath of that as well. So I want to start just with some context and to talk about the growth of the multiracial population in the United States. So the first time that individuals could identify with multiple race categories was in 2000. I assure you that there are individuals who would have identified that way, but 2000 was the first time that they were federally recognized as being able to do so. And in 2020, the most recent census showed that there was a more than doubling, 127% increase in the proportion of individuals identifying with multiple races in the United States. So when you look at this map here, you see a kind of blue impression across the map that is in recognition of these blue lines, which show that the proportion of people of color is increasing, and the growth of the multiracial population is really one of the drivers of that. This is a demographic that is disproportionately young. The average age is typically that of a college applicant. And that's both because of rising rates of interracial marriage in the United States, as well as the change in identification processes on the census. So more individuals are also able to identify as mixed race. Now, this change to the census was approved in 1997. So we are almost 30 years past that approval. But if you look at how universities represent racial diversity to this day, even, or at least in recent years, you'll see that there isn't a standard way of representing mixed race identities. So here's an example of kind of two different strategies when it comes to counting mixed race identities. To the left, this is MIT's diversity statistics. They note here that these sums actually add up to more than 100% because they've double counted those who identify with multiple race categories. So if you identify as Black and white, you count as a Black person and you count as a white person. UC Davis here on the right is kind of the foil to this. Here it shows a reallocation process. I won't make you do the math, but if you trust me, all of these numbers add up to exactly 100%. So unless UC Davis has 0 mixed race identifying individuals, which I highly doubt, they have actually reallocated those identities to comport with this classification system. It's not clear how they do that or which decisions they make, but maybe this talk will let you infer how you think that. One other very quick example here, when it comes to the representation of diversity and multiracial. Here, this is NC State, and they have a kind of aggregate representation. They say that 30% of incoming freshmen are diverse. And they do list different categories here, including multiracial, but there is very little discussion of which of those categories might actually be counted as diverse. And don't bother doing the math, the numbers don't add up to 30%. So there's also some ambiguity there. At the bottom here is Boston College. They've created a group that they've called AHANA, African American, Hispanic, Asian, and Native American in aggregate, to represent racial diversity. Whether or not multiracial individuals end up there, one might presume that they're included, but you don't also know the breakdown of those individual categories. You just know that in aggregate, there are about 30% students in this crafted group that Boston College has created. So I want you to imagine, I'll go back. If you're a mixed race student applying to college in 2021 and you see these different depictions, you might really have no clue how your identity is going to be classified. And if you're thinking about affirmative action and if it applies to you, you also really might not have any idea as to how a university might classify your identity or what meanings it might ascribe to it. And adding to this ambiguity is the fact that there's very little understanding of how these applications are actually assessed in the United States. So we know that selective universities use a process called holistic review. That is an evaluation of the full applicant. So that means that in addition to one's academic performance, universities are permitted and should actually account for things like an applicant's character as portrayed in an interview or in their life experiences and personal essays, their extracurriculars. And universities are forthcoming that diversity is something that they value. But they don't disclose how much it matters in the assessment of an application or in a decision. And this whole process, of course, is very fiercely guarded. And the relative ambiguity and opacity of this process gives universities, or at least it gave universities, a pretty thick shield in terms of how they made decisions regarding diversity and to what degree diversity matters. So in this study or in this book project, I'm really focused on how multiracial applicants and their families are discerning the boundary of diversity in U.S. selective college admissions. And what I want to suggest is that that the assessment or the discernment of diversity is really subject to a process that I'm calling identity appraisals. And that refers to the kind of discernment of the meanings and values that are assigned to specific identities. So those are questions like, well, do I count for diversity? Do I benefit from affirmative action? How much? And what does my identity mean to these colleges and universities? So here I'm thinking about the kind of stereotypes or tropes that might be associated with specific racial identities and how those might come into play and how that would inform self-presentation in the application. Depending on how you identify which racial checkboxes you choose to check, how you write your personal essay, for example. And I'm using the terminology of appraisal in a very intentional way. An appraisal is an assessment. The college admissions process is an inherently evaluative process. If one is assessing if one is competitive for admission or not. But it's also a productive, I want to argue, a culturally productive process. It also, an appraisal is an assessment of, or an estimate of the value of something. And I want to suggest that these processes of identity appraisals are creating meaning or assigning value to specific identities as applicants are faced with this ambiguity. So this is a longitudinal interview study that I conducted when I was at Stanford. I recruited multiracial families from the San Francisco Bay Area, so San Francisco, San Jose. As I said, in 2021 to 2022, that was one of the final admission cycles where race-based affirmative action was legal. That entailed about 75 interviews with college applicants as well as their parents. I'm happy to talk about the decision to include families in the Q&A. And also some of my methods in terms of the analysis. And just very quickly, I won't go through this for the sake of time, but this just gives you an overview of my sample and the different kind of racial combinations that are present in my sample, as well as their gender identity and where they go to school. Now, to give you a flavor of the kind of breadth of identity appraisals and how they inform applicant behavior, I want to show you 3 different family portraits. And they all differ very much in their assessment of the multiracial identity and how it ultimately informs their applicant behavior. So I'll start with the Adamsons, who really view a multiracial identity as potentially a liability. It features Annie, who identifies as Mexican and white, and her mother, Evelyn, who is Mexican and did not finish college. So even by Penn's definition, Annie would be a first-generation college student. They're lower middle class, but they attend a private high school in the East Bay on scholarship. I'll contrast them with the Campbells, who attend the same high school. This is an Asian white family who are upper middle class. Melissa, the mother, identifies as Eurasian, and her daughter, Clara, identifies as Asian and white. Both of her parents graduated from an elite university, and they ultimately see multiraciality as a kind of asset for them. And then I'll close with Quincy and the Bakers, who see a multiracial identity actually as irrelevant. This is a Black-white family. They're also upper middle class. And Quincy's father, Brad, went to a Penn-like institution, one of the very few Black men in the United States who have graduated from an Ivy League university, and they also attend a private high school, but this time in San Francisco. So Annie and Evelyn are really seeing multiraciality as a liability to Annie's chances of being admitted. And that appraisal stems from Evelyn's own experiences working or volunteering at this private high school and her own process of applying to private high school in the San Francisco Bay Area. So she notes that when she attends a function at her daughter's high school, or when she would go to interviews for her daughter's admission to private high school in the San Francisco Bay Area, that she had a kind of character or a trope to play. So she says here, to be completely honest, it's a dog and pony show. She needs to show up and be as Mexican as possible, that she needs to push a specific project of what it means to be Mexican. And it's a very specific kind. It's not a scary kind. She notes that it sucks, and she's very resentful of it. But she needs to be Mexican enough. I'm not a gang member, but enough to give schools their street cred. So she already, Evelyn, has learned a very specific presentation of diversity, and she translates this to recommending to her daughter to hide the whiteness, the white aspect of her identity, to kind of play the same sort of project and to lean into the Mexican part of her identity. And her daughter, Annie, is a little bit more resistant to this when I talk with her. She's very wedded, actually, to her multiracial identity. But she outlines another reason that she ultimately agrees with her mother and decides to only identify as Mexican. And that's really about the cost of paying tuition. So as I noted, this is a low-income family. So they are not in a position to afford a private college education in the United States, which at this point is closing in on $100,000 per year without financial aid. So she notes that in contrast to her classmates who might also identify as multiracial or part white, those applicants, they're paying full tuition. Tuition bills are not something that they need to worry about. So they can check off their white side. So for her, her whiteness is actually really representing a liability, not only for admission, but for her ability to afford going to college. For them, it's not much like I need to get this, as she quotes, a colored woman in STEM scholarship, or I need to get that checked off for the scholarship. They don't have to worry about that. If they got in, they can just pay. So they don't need to really check off those identity boxes as much as she does. So for her, this is also very much, her identity appraisal is very much also rooted in her class position, and that informs how she ultimately chooses to portray her racial or her ethno-racial identity, I should say. In contrast, we have the Campbells, Melissa and Clara, who see multiraciality as an asset. So Melissa is, or I should say rather, sorry, Clara is the youngest of 3 siblings. So this is Melissa's 3rd turn as an admissions mom. And she noted that actually when she was looking at some of the college guidebooks that she had used, for the first time she had noted that there was a multiracial category in the college guidebook that she was using. And she says, well, being counted as mixed feels like it could be a tiny bit of an advantage, whereas the individual components, Asian and white, are almost a disadvantage potentially. And she notes that, well, if colleges must be putting out a mixed race category, if FISC, this college guidebook, is including it, and they're touting it. So, it's definitely a selling point that these colleges are putting out. So it does feel like, oh, we got to slide into the multiracial category, even if the individual components are overrepresented. So for her, being included in a mixed category means an escape from 2 racial categories that she sees as being disadvantaged because of the overrepresentation or well-representation of Asian and white individuals. And for her, she actually sees the multiracial category as potentially a new underrepresented minority category. So when we think about underrepresented groups, perhaps multiracial also counts. And then finally, I'll talk about the Bakers. This is a Black-white family. And Brad here, similarly to Evelyn, notes very much that he feels like he has a role to play as a Black father and as a Black Ivy League graduate. So he talks about with his wife, or he notes that his wife and him always joke that he is the face of admissions. And he says, well, you know, I might not be able to get a cab in the rain in New York City, but I can get my kids into school. So he already knows very much that for him, at least in his view, that the fact that his son can identify as a Black man as well is going to serve him in the college admissions process. And yet his son, Quincy, comes to a very different conclusion. His son has been one of the very few Black students in any of his high schooling. And he talks very much about feeling ostracized because of that or tokenized. He's like the Black friend, and he's identified as Black constantly. And so he ultimately decides to sidestep the entire college admissions process where affirmative action is relevant. So as he calls them, predominantly white institutions, and he wants to go to a historically Black college instead. And when I asked him about why he was choosing to do this, he says, well, predominantly white institutions are trying to look diverse so that they can look more desirable. Not necessarily so that they can have like a better community all the time. In contrast, as he sees it, historically Black colleges and universities, they're not like really trying to get white people to HBCUs. Like their whole principle is very different in terms of the community that they're trying to cultivate. And for him, he sees this as kind of, as he says, taking race out of the equation. And he ultimately forgoes both the benefits that his father assures him he would have as a beneficiary of affirmative action, but also as a legacy student at an Ivy League institution. So he forgoes all of that. So just to summarize the exhibits that I've shared here, you can see the different kind of assessments of advantage and disadvantage here that each family comes to as it relates to each specific identity, as well as to the multiracial category. So you see some consensus here in terms of the disadvantage associated with whiteness, but especially if you compare Anthony and Clara, you see how Annie comes to a kind of, we think about this in a mathematical combination. She sees advantage and disadvantage leading to disadvantage, whereas Clara sees disadvantage and disadvantage ultimately actually leading to an advantage. And then you see here again, Quincy is the one who decides to sidestep all of that and says his multiracial identity is going to be irrelevant. So I hope even in this very short walkthrough of some of my data for my book project, I hope I've convinced you that this college admissions process is productive. It creates these identity appraisals, which produce meanings associated with different groups. So it produces the meaning of what a Hispanic student is supposed to be for a university. It produces meanings of what a multiracial category might be as an underrepresented group. And it also spurs the applicant behavior. It changes how they inform, how they identify, how they depict themselves, and to which universities they ultimately apply. So again, we see the kind of different assessments here. And I want to note that I've used multiracial applicants because of their resistance to standard modes of categorization. That means that they're especially sensitive to this kind of meaning-making process. And they're also more likely to spur this productive process because they resist those standard classifications. Okay, so I started this talk by talking about how the boundaries of diversity expand or contract to accommodate groups. So we saw in Germany the kind of persistence and primary focus on women in contrast to a more elaborated or expanded understanding of diversity in the UK and in the US, or among elite universities, I should say. And in the US, we see this uncertainty right now regarding multiracial individuals and whether or not they do or do not count for diversity. As I postulate, maybe we could even make this a list, but I've come up with different ideas of what other types of diversity might be counted moving forward, even in this current day and age. One might be nationality or international student status. I won't flip back all the way through, but if you recall those different diversity depictions that I opened my book project with, you might recall that international was actually counted as the category among racial diversity, kind of signaling that international is also an aspect of identity, or an aspect of diversity that will come to the fore. We can think about Andy's remarks about being a woman of color pursuing STEM, so gender and field of study, socioeconomic status, of course, the example that I opened with, as well as immigrant background, highly relevant in the German context, language, religion, ability, as well as ideology. I'm sure if we all thought about this, we could probably add a few more identities. I'm realizing I didn't include sexual orientation to your point, so there you go. Okay, I'm almost done. So I wanted you all to think about this question as I was talking. So is diversity's lack of definition its strength or its vulnerability? So I want to suggest that some of the affordances with this kind of vague definition of diversity is it's adaptable, right? It allows for this for those different kind of nationally distinctive manifestations and definitions of diversity amidst global pressures. It also affords universities a lot of flexibility in how they choose to portray diversity in terms of which categories they would like to include or not include. And that even allows for the accommodation of identities that are resistant to the kind of current classification. We saw evidence of that at the beginning of my book project here. And in some respects, this means that anyone can kind of claim a diverse identity. So in that respect, kind of diversity is eligible, or is an equal opportunity employer, so to speak. But now if we think about the vulnerabilities, it creates conditions for ambiguity and for appraisal. So this is this kind of value assessment of identity that is very poignant and very intimate and quite painful for a lot of the applicants or a lot of the participants in my study. It also creates this combination of ambiguity and ubiquity. So the Mackenzie Pearson case is a case of ambiguity, but this is, you can think of other instances of this, I'm sure, if you think about your own experiences in higher education. And the fact that there is both ambiguity and ubiquity means that it's very hard to enforce diversity. So Sarah Ahmed talks about the fact that because diversity is so commonplace and can mean so many different things, it actually works as a shield to not enforce diversity at all. And it reduces diversity to a series of checkboxes, which individuals can fulfill, or a series of mandates that universities can fulfill. And because diversity can take on so many different types of meanings, it means that it's also especially likely to have meanings ascribed to it that are actually not what was intended. So we can think about reverse discrimination allegations or allegations that diversity is really about ideological repression, for example. And I want to bring these up because, as you might all know, the backlash against diversity right now in all three of the national contexts that I've talked about has been quite fierce. So the United States is really at a fever pitch right now. The Department of Education is threatening to eliminate federal funding from any university that continues to reference race or think about race-based programs in any form or fashion. Last year, there was an op-ed from a group of professors in Germany who, this one here, as you can imagine, who note that these diversity numbers are without merit and actually compromise excellence. And here you see in the UK that there's a new initiative that would cut funding actually for the failure to promote diversity, which, as this article says, may support ideological repression, and in my view would also spur the kind of number manipulation and categorical manipulation in order to avoid those funding cuts. Now, I've talked for long enough, and I will own the fact that sociologists are very good at defining and identifying problems, but less good at solving them. So we can maybe talk about this together in this interdisciplinary group. But I want to close by thinking about how we might redefine diversity. So throughout this talk, I've noted that diversity has really been functioning in a much more neoliberal sense as a marker of prestige or an organizational commodity. It's a way to be seen as legitimate or a way to compete in a global ecology. And that really means that the diversity has been reduced to what Laura Hamilton and Kelly Nielsen call the shallow representation of underrepresented groups. Again, we see that kind of undefined or open to interpretation, aggregate category that allows for this ambiguity and flexibility on the part of both organizations and individuals. So what I suggest we think about diversity instead of is really as an educational good. There is heaps of literature I'm not citing sufficiently here that show that there are real educational benefits to learning in a diverse, however defined group. People are better problem solvers, they're more critical thinkers, they're more civically engaged, and they're also much more tolerant of other groups things that you might think of as a real societal good and an individual good as well. And really, we should remember what the introduction of the diversity initiatives was for in the first place. So the United States, this was born out of the civil rights movement. And this was really seen as a form of justice. This was meant to be a way to remediate and acknowledge historical wrongs. And we've moved so far away from that, I would argue, that we've gone to such a numbers and representation understanding of diversity that we've forgotten actually what it's supposed to be. So I would close my talk with that call to action. And I'll thank you all again very much for your attention. I look forward to your comments.
Very much, Sonia. That was excellent. So let's have David.
Thank you very much, Sonia. That rang so many bells. I have to say, I was both delighted and really quite frightened by in many ways, and not frightened so much by things that you've said, because you've sort of said in many ways that some of the things I've been trying to say in also a fairly recent paper, which I cheaply entitle Eyes Right, a little bit like the military march, with a strong exclamation mark, a colon, and talk of global uncertainty and populism and the tussle for the future of education. And my sense, in at least my reading of things, the idea of eyes right is that perhaps for too long, sociologists or political scientists, colleagues like myself, etc., thought of education or higher education largely as a public good. We formed a view of society in which diversity is a strength. Clearly, that the whole philosophy of education, and we can take that as far back as we like, has really been the mission or role, purpose thereof has been to create societies that were at once perhaps democratic, progressive, or kind places in which human beings could learn to flourish and thrive. But I'm afraid we've been upended. And we've been upended in a sense because we've sort of taken our eyes off what the right wing is doing, and right-wing populism has arisen and almost caught many people by surprise. Many people don't actually, or didn't, at least up to very recently, believe that there was any content to right-wing populism or the shifts we see in Germany, in France, to some extent, the free speech debate in the UK, and so on. So I think, I think we in a very serious place. I mean, I've made notes as you've spoken about. There's some fascinating pieces in your paper, the idea of ascribed meanings when we look at the characteristics of diversity, and of course protected characteristics. And it's interesting how universities in Germany or in the United States or anywhere really use these matrices in which to try and impose, if you like, a fairness in admission to be true in a sense to the ultimate mission and purpose of education, freedoms, and so on. But the tensions, which are interesting, which you started off by talking about in your paper, the tensions between, say, gender parity, which has been very clear and clearly understood for as long as we can remember, and the idea of diversity, which is at once both a new concept but an old concept. Yes. Old in the sense, as you just said, of the civil rights movement in the United States, or elsewhere, we can think of the idea that anywhere that we might imagine there was a purpose and a strong sense, whether post-colonial South Asia or post-colonial Africa, to attend to historical inequalities, to set these right, to attend to historical disadvantages, and to understand those things. And they weren't narrow categories of diversity. It had nothing to do with race or necessarily in the project to remedy. It might have had things to do with race and ethnicity and many other things, in a sense, in the project to divide. So I was quite struck by that, and quite struck at how actually, and I think it's Nancy Fraser, a sociologist that you might recognize in the United States, who does speak of this disintegration within the left as different strands of diversity began to take prominence, and perhaps away from a more recognizable project, whether that project was civil rights or anti-apartheid or some kind of European unity or and stuff. So these are really important issues. You raise what I sort of liberally sort of scribbled down, the idea of adherence lead German universities to the Bologna process. How do we adhere to categories that we'd like to think are useful and important and progressive, but at the same time, because of the very rapidly shifting world, are becoming very complicated. And your case studies of the three families that we show in how people take ascribed meanings and think about them in ways that make these ascribed meanings either beneficial or not. So here's multiracialism, etc., as you pointed out, with the three different families, a positive category. Does it enable? Does it constrain? What in a sense does all of this mean? And I suppose if I could just maybe touch on one or two things I've said in my writing, really, that global political and economic uncertainty, we are living in a very uncertain world, has opened up new rhetorical spaces in which nationalism and right-wing populism has thrived. And they really raise new questions about our understanding of society and what this means for the future of education. This paper is particularly interested in the rise of right-wing populism and how this has impacted on higher education and other forms of education, the curriculum, and so on in the United States. But it is a real challenge, and the challenge, I think, is a philosophical challenge. It's on the one hand, there are some real questions about how do we make these categories, these ascribed meanings, the idea of diversity, one that we might be able to maximize and draw strength from. How do we keep in focus the old meanings when new meanings are so prevalent and so strong? So how do we maximize? How do we seek to find productive meanings in the idea of diversity? But for right-wing populism and a new world, there is absolutely, we have to come to terms with it. There is a real movement to upend diversity, to a strong search for singularity, a strong search not for the sort of freedoms and opportunities that diversity we know allows us, but really a return to so-called normality or uncertainty, which again, we have to look very stared in the face, which discussions and debates about diversity and pluralism have, in a sense, upended. So Nancy Fraser, sociologist in the US, would talk of new capitalism, fast capitalism, new money, Hollywood, new rhetorics that ultimately have undermined the old jobs in the American Rust Belt,
Yes.
the old senses of securities in the American Rust Belt. And people have actually turned against the idea of diversity and the idea of productivity and what that might bring. So I think, without wanting to say much more, I think your paper raises some hugely important issues. And of course, as we all would, we would like to seek from this your call to action. What do we do to sustain, to make diversity something that remains meaningful, that remains something that we need to protect, fight for. But if we take our eyes off what has now become a very coherent rhetoric of right-wing populism and don't recognize the extent to which they've gone to upend diversity, we'll be in real trouble. So I think it was even yesterday in Times, I think it was, Oxford gets another mention, as it usually does. Somebody has counted 59 diversity posts, right? Alongside this article, same newspaper shows firings at 2 Scottish universities and a few English universities, Newcastle and so on. So jobs being lost, many dozens of jobs being lost. So in a sense, the 2 articles aren't connected, but for the reader, saying Oxford is spending, and I think it's over 2.5 million, the sort of salary bill for 59 diversity posts. And the other article on the same page is basically saying, dozens of academics are losing their jobs because universities are in a terrible state. I don't think it's accidental. I think there's a huge drive to the sense of upending diversity. I'll leave it there, but it's a fascinating paper. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, David. Back to respond to that point, or Peter's more, shall we continue?
I'll just briefly respond and say that I think you're right on. And I was just saying earlier before I came down here that as I've been writing this book, it's a long-standing project. You can see when I started the data collection for it, the political landscape in which I was starting to analyze these interviews has changed so dramatically. And so making these critiques of diversity politics before and after first the fall of affirmative action in the United States, and also now in the face of how Trump has really gone cataclysmic with anti-DEI initiatives, has made actually landing this argument, I think, even a little bit more delicate and more tenuous. Because I think you're right. In many ways, I'm ascribing a lot of the vulnerability and faults of where we are now to the ways that universities have kind of commodified diversity. So I'll just say thank you very much. I certainly agree.
Great. Can I just ask a couple of questions when I was listening to your presentation? My first point is something that I didn't understand. Maybe you kind of mentioned it, but why in Germany is there this persistence with the gender issue and the resistance to kind of amplify that notion of diversity? Can you give some context in that? Why do we see that in Germany?
In terms of gender equality, I can surmise a few different things. So one, I think, is also the ways that German higher education has been structured. It's a much more feudal process. in terms of their kind of being a master, Herr Professor, who kind of dictates how things are run. And I think the entire system is seen as extremely masculine. There's a masculinity to the way that research is produced and who is really typified as a professor. That's not to say that that doesn't occur here or in the United States, but I think that is especially virulent in the German context. And so the idea of who pursues higher education, I think, is masculine, or is masculinized rather. And the sorting structure in the German system in terms of when students are identified as being fit for Hochschule, so for the higher education track, happens much earlier. It happens when students are in their fourth year. So it happens much earlier than in the United States. And I think then already the kind of gender ideas of who is fit for our college education and who isn't are kind of much more salient. So those would be my two suppositions. And I would say too, if we look at gender equality, another metric of it, German higher education lags far behind in terms of the representation of professors who are women, and that number has not increased very much at all in the last 2 decades. So that was to your first point.
Yeah, I think the second, because I saw, okay.
Thank you for this talk. Diversity in higher education is, of course, the laudable objective, regardless of what President Trump or the Supreme Court may say. But you focused on admission decisions, and so, but that's maybe the most important part, but not the only part, right? So, I mean, we can talk about diversity in faculty, diversity in curriculum. Is your thesis or hunch or hypothesis that is covariant with some sort of time lag, or that the issue of the admissions in and of itself is important enough to understand? Because I can imagine a perfectly meritocratic, diverse admissions process into an institution that continues to be very quixotic in terms of its faculty composition and in terms of its curriculum. So, and that's, to me, is not a very happy constellation. So I want to push you a little on why is it that you are asking us to care about admissions if our headline objective is diversity in higher education. I'll raise one more issue. I think to our right is the Middle East Studies Center, where a critique of Orientalism is in the curriculum, and everyone gets to read Said's Impressive of Orientalism, but there is a particular demography to that. You get nice upper class kids from the Middle East. In the righteous indignation towards nice working class Europeans, right? It's easy to criticize Orientalism while the nice upper class kids from the Middle East also has very disagreeable relationships to working class people in their own country. So, I mean, not all diversity is the same, and I know you were arguing this, but can we push you a little on the glaring blind spots in sort of class, for example? Some type of diversity crusade is more sexy than others and easier than others. And should we not have something to say about that as well? Somewhere, maybe not in your book, but I mean, in our radar, in our utopia, in our thesaurus of what constitutes the just and the good and the beautiful, is there some role for that?
Yes, there
I'll
are
go
two
ahead.
here. So yeah.
And so you were also asking about the kind of steady resistance to kind of amplifying or expanding diversity. So I do think that we've done some interviews with German diversity initiatives. First of all, thank you, both very good questions. So we've done interviews with German diversity officers and gender equality officers. And there are a couple of different reasons why there's so much hesitancy around this. One is really it's very palpable when you talk to people. When you propose, for example, the collection of race and ethnicity is really something that is very taboo. But even if you ask about migration background, for example, which is often kind of functions as a cognate, I mean, there are people who say, "Oh no, definitely not. That's what the Nazis did. Like, absolutely not. I am not going to be asking about that." And so there's a real, very palpable fear of what this kind of social categorization and data collection might represent. The other thing is, apropos to data collection, Germany has some of the most stringent data protection laws anywhere. And so the collection of other types of identity dimensions is also really fiercely resisted because they are concerned that that will actually enable the identification of some of these individuals, especially as you get more granular. So even migration background, there is some contestation about who is a migrant or who has an immigration background or not, but that at least functions a little bit more broadly than race or ethnicity. But that is also an element of this too, is data protection, and which is very much entrenched in the German context. And to your question, I might sort of sum up your question as, when does diversity end, and or when should we stop caring about diversity? And I definitely do not want to project or intimate that college admissions is the only time when we should think about diversity. I've focused on it because it's been the subject of so many legal debates and political debates, and that's where the media attention is. And it is, I mean, in material terms, a very important juncture in young people's lives. I mean, it's very clear if I were to show you kind of distributions of those with a BA versus not, like there are very real material economic benefits to attending college and to attending certain kinds of college. So the stakes of attending college and the right kind of college in the United States and affirmative action is very real. But I completely agree with you. I mean, part of this talk is the narrowing of our definition of diversity, and its tethering especially to things like college admissions or material stakes, means that we don't get to focus on other parts of diversity. Or at least there's less of it. In some of my other work, I also looked at multiracial students, college students who had already been admitted, so they had already been past the college admissions process. And ostensibly, maybe some of those diversity pressures would have lessened. And they talk about how in their everyday life in undergrad, they still encounter these kinds of what I've called compromises around their identity. Which dorm are they allowed to live in and why? In diversity trainings, they get split into 4 Black, white, Asian, Hispanic groups, for example. So this kind of diversity imperative does not end after the college admissions process. And certainly, I mean, you mentioned some of them. Faculty diversity is still quite bleak, I will say, in the United States, and much harder to change because of the ways that academic posts don't expire as quickly, right? College turnover rate is for every 4 years. It's probably every 40 years for an academic position. And to your point too, I mean, when we think this is, if we think about the kind of elaboration of diversity, the kind of ideological diversity and who inhabits which kind of intellectual spaces, what kind of knowledge production is valued, those are all things that kind of get lost in the shuffle of diversity when we only think about it as representation. So, I mean, I appreciate the push. I think we're actually probably in more agreement maybe in terms of the limits or expansion of diversity and where it's actually relevant to be critical of it.
Thank you.
Tim. Sonia, thanks very much. Fascinating. I have 2 questions. The first I'm going to formulate slightly provocatively. Should universities promote confusion?
Okay.
Because the story you're telling is one of confusion.
Yes.
Right? Or to put it slightly more bluntly, of the conflation of multiple different logics.
Yes.
Under the heading diversity. I detected at least 4. Number 1, a classic liberal logic of equality of individual opportunity.
Yes.
Your very first example.
Yes.
Low income, first generation, foster youth. That's a logic of individual. Second, a logic of collective representation of underrepresented groups.
Yep.
Actually, what we call gender equality is in fact that.
Yes.
Right? Now that again seems to me extremely cogent logic, but it's a different logic, right? Thirdly, instrumental argument. Diversity is good for innovation, creativity.
Yes.
Hey, why are German universities not in the top 100? Maybe they need a bit more Anglo-Saxon. Right. The fourth one I thought was very interesting. Quincy, actually, at the end, he said, it'll give us a better community. So they're really interesting. So you've got at least 4 different logics at first glance. And so my question to you, let me push you on this. Don't you think universities, which are meant to be places for clear thought, shouldn't favor some sort of clarity and coherence over confusion? Right? I spell out clearly, even if there are different logics involved, what they are. That's question number 1. Question number 2 is actually, and this goes to David's point, there's one kind of diversity the right is keen on, and only one, ideological diversity.
Yeah.
So one of their principal critiques, and Neil Ferguson and others, is in universities you only meet liberals. You never meet conservatives, you never meet voices. I actually think there's a point there. There is a point. I think if a purpose of university is for you to be confronted with the diversity of views, then it's a good thing when people are confronted with conservatism. So the question there is, you tagged it on at the very end of your list, right? Ideology. Do any of these institutions actually prioritize ideological diversity? And then if I could tempt you to the normative statement, do you think they should?
They should care about ideological diversity, should they? Yes. Very good. I appreciate the provocation. So maybe I'll start with ideological diversity. I didn't mean to tag it right at the end, but perhaps that's actually kind of illustrative of the current politics around diversity right now. I mean, I still recall when affirmative action was, I don't remember actually when exactly this was, but Ann Coulter was saying, well, the people who should really benefit the most from affirmative action are Republicans. There are hardly any of them on campus. Republican groups are so few, they should be sought after in so many ways. And I will say, I think that there is, as you said, I think there is a point there that if the crux of the diversity rationale as a kind of educational good to create more critical thinkers and more open-minded thinkers is about the kind of differing perspective and experiences, then Republican ideology might be incorporated in that as well, or should be incorporated in that as well. I don't think it's very politically viable to go and recruit Republicans per se. But I do think that there are other kinds of diversity that don't get enveloped in the kind of common ways of thinking about diversity that would actually reach many more individuals who have probably been ostracized, potentially conservative leaning, and feel even more ostracized because of that. And that's thinking a lot about, I mean, we think about where do you recruit from, which rural communities, for example, are those individuals that also count? So we have these definitions of first generation or low income. Are those identities or are those individuals that universities go and actively recruit? There are some initiatives too. Yes. Was it with the same sheen, I guess you could say, as with other kinds of diversity? Likely no. I mean, to your point, as you said, some forms of diversity are a little sexier than others, or at least translate at least to representation in a much more obvious way than ideological diversity. So if we are thinking about the kind of form of justice and increasing access, there are many Republicans and many low-income students who have not been incorporated or have not been met by kind of diversity and inclusion initiatives. So in that sense, if they should be, I don't know if they're thinking about specifically recruiting Republicans, but if they're thinking about increasing access and what other ideological perspectives they might include, that would be one way to do that. I do also think, I mean, this is related now more directly to our discussion about populism and the kind of messaging that the Democrats in the United States have really adopted around DEI, that it's turned into kind of like finger waving. Paul and I have talked about this, that this has really spelled a demise, I think, and has fostered this kind of ignorance of very real right-wing critiques around populism, is that if you don't agree with diversity, all of a sudden you get your finger waved at. And all of a sudden then the concerns, the very real concerns and real points that might actually be enveloped in ideas of diversity actually Bo forgot. So I don't like to give J.D. Vance's book so much airtime, especially as that has aged. But maybe we can think about Tara Westover instead as a different example. She wrote a book called Educated and then did a PhD here at Cambridge. I see some nods, so maybe some are familiar. So she grew up in this like survivalist family that was very anti-establishment in the woods of Idaho. And she had she ends up at BYU, kind of by accident, actually. And then ultimately ends up becoming a PhD candidate at Cambridge and is very accomplished. And she talks about the kind of real transformation of her own thinking and how she's thought about the world through going through university. But she's not someone that is often thought of as the kind of diverse candidate. And the very real concerns of her family growing up in a junkyard are not ones that are necessarily met. I've now gone a little bit off script, but to your point, yes, there are other ways I think of thinking about diversity that could include more diverse perspectives in ways that are not so hand wavy and shameful. That could kind of increase the staying power of diversity. Okay, now to your other point about should they be promoting confusion? Well, I don't know. I think we're kind of in this mess because they've promoted confusion, and I think they're really good at it. I mean, what's amazing too is if we were to go and look at some of these diversity texts across the United States or wherever, they're even across these different logics, they're actually remarkably uniform. So we can probably find distinctions or evidence of all of these different logics that you very nicely outlined, but across the entire higher education spectrum, they're incredibly good at spelling out these different logics in these kind of couched terms. And I think, I mean, part of that I think is a legal byproduct of making sure that they are conforming to what is legally permissible. But the confusion is kind of the point. That's what allows them the flexibility. That's what allows them to create categories like AHANA, which I had never heard of. African American, Hispanic, Asian, Native American, which I included. I mean, like these categories, because they can rely on all of these different logics at the most opportune times. Paul, I see your hand.
There's one David first, and then it's fine.
Thank you very much. David, my question is for you. At one point you mentioned the term normality. Would you care to define normality in today's world?
It's a very good point. I suppose it's a tough one, isn't it? I think most of us in our communities seek some sense of normality in a world that is very confusing. I'm a psychologist, so I would probably be the first to admit there's probably no normalcy, no normality in that sense of the word, but there are familiarities, there are states of mind, states of being, states of society that we've grown up with, and I think the world's unraveling in a way that sends us looking for familiarity, or what we might call in shorthand, normality, where things make sense. And I'm afraid it's not that easy to find this. That was the only sense of the language.
Paul?
Sonia, thank you very much. It's really very well presented. I was struck by your opening example of University of Pennsylvania, what I felt to be a quite scandalous definition of first generation. Very, very different from the world that I remember people talked about what it meant to be a first generation university student. And then in some of your stories of California, in terms of parents and applicants understanding how to tick boxes, right? So I thought it was interesting because there's a gaming the system model.
Yeah.
Which you would think is generally on the part of parents and applicants, but there's also the institutions are gaming their own system, right? The University of Pennsylvania is playing with criteria in such a way as to completely expand the definition of what it is to be first generation. So that it seems to me the deeper issue is that these elite universities are failing in terms of recruiting non-white, or at least now in a sense non-Asian student bodies. And so is one in which it's very difficult to know, of course, if they're doing well or not, because their statistics are so massaged,
Yes.
right? And there are too many caricatures of these stories in terms of how people are getting in the system.
Yeah.
So in a sense, it feeds a kind of right-wing frenzy about the
Yes.
hyper-political correctness of what in fact is going on. But it's also one in which these universities that are desperately trying to be more diverse, they're not really providing the information because they're constantly in a kind of world in which they're competing in a commercial market for students and against other universities.
Yes.
There's no sense in which they're actually presenting the information clearly to the public because they're so worried about that they're going to come out badly in this
Yeah.
comparison. So what Tim's talking about is confusion. It's a kind of study ambiguity and a kind of promotion. It's a really kind of almost kind of proud to speak about the success of their programs.
Yeah.
In fact, they're failing, but they have a strategy of desperately trying to hide failures.
Yeah.
And so that's what gets picked up by the regular media because they're aware of this game that's going on. That's
Yeah.
not just driven from below; it's actually driven from institutions themselves.
Yes. So, I mean, a big part of this is that universities are producers of these categories and these meetings. I mean, there is a narrative that others could tell that, oh, well, these mixed race applicants are in this prime position to be these slippery instrumentalists, and they just are like chameleons, and they can adjust their identities whenever they feel like it, so that they can benefit from different affirmative action or scholarships or whatever, what have you. And that's really not borne out at all in the data. There's actually like very intentional thought processes about how to represent identities. And Annie's case, the one who decides not to identify as white, is the only instance out of the 21 students, 20 families in my study, who actually does not identify with all aspects of her identity. And as she talks about, it's very much driven by concerns about cost. And I do make a point, maybe provocatively, to point to this kind of gamesmanship on the point of universities, because I have to admit, when I went back to this Mackenzie Kirsten example, I was ready. I took some screenshots from the leaflet or the news release when she was awarded the fellowship, because I was positive that Penn, after all of this controversy, would have adjusted its definition of first generation. And that is still to this day how they define first generation college. So the gamesmanship, and I should also say their president at the time, who is now the ambassador to Germany, Amy Gutmann, she made a huge centerpiece of her presidency was the fact that she doubled the number of first generation college students during her presidency. Wonder how that happened. So no, you're right. I mean, back to your point, there is a confusion, but there's a kind of prescribed confusion. It's like a choreographed dance that is meant to be kind of schizophrenic in some ways, but is actually very intentional in everything we do. So
Yes, please. Can you speak up, please?
Okay, I have got a question towards the Dr. David about your emphasis on the uncertainty may bring up more new narratives. So what does the new narratives refer to, and especially to the populist American this trend? So will America become a forum to negotiate the diversity? Because which the ideology is quite different, maybe from some civilizations channeling the harmonious inclusion and the maybe more collaboration rather than the competition of the scarcity of the resource. So I wonder, how do you think American could be a forum, and what does the new narrative as you emphasize mean? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and that's a very well put question. Thank you. It's complicated. I mean, there has been, as in in China, there's economic uncertainty. There's actually a group of colleagues, and they've been doing this project for at least the last 10 years at the University of Stanford. So economic historians and political scientists have come together over a cup of coffee, and one lot sort of look at the newspapers and look at historical events and have charted this back to the 1900s, to the Great Depression. The other lot, the economists, have said, what have all these big events, these big political, historical events, meant for our our sense of how secure we are economically. So these aren't stock market figures, but they've actually managed to produce a graph in which on the x-axis you actually go back to the 1900s and chart all of these big political events, the Great Depression, the crisis in the Panama Canal, downturn in the Chinese economy, the election of Donald Trump, first time, and the second time. And the economists sort of, draw graphs that show, that give a sense of how people feel about, how certain they feel about whether to buy that new car or the security of their jobs and so on. So this has actually been developed a bit further, and we now have an index actually of global uncertainty, which is really a fascinating piece of scholarly work from across these different disciplines. My argument is that looking at this index, of course, most recently being European elections, and the far right in Germany has made a terribly, I don't want to use the word good, but significant showing, as it were, as Le Pen and so on in France, and all these debates. But the sense of uncertainty, the sense of uncomfortableness, has actually emboldened rhetoric that in the past would have been seen as, not here, not anywhere, not in our space. So in Germany, again, some of the rhetoric, some of the things that people say, and the boldness with which they say it is frightening. But for the United States in particular, terms like American exceptionalism, America first, and we've seen just in the last 24 hours what Donald Trump is capable of, just signing tariffs into order, stopping aid with Elon Musk to many parts of the world, and munitions supplies to Ukraine. So there is a new rhetoric, there's a new discourse, there's a new language, some of it which is actually quite frightening. But it's the point I was making earlier. It's about the sharpness of this language to challenge what we've always accepted to be the ordinary, what we've always accepted to be the state of play. We haven't ever, I don't think, as we are now forced to, question, the deep philosophy of education. What does it mean? If philosophy is, if education is in the service, as it were, of a philosophical approach that we can trace back to, I don't know, Comenius, challenged the church as far as the 1600s and so on, about the sense of what education means. In China, of course, this question is still very alive. What does it mean to be an educated person? It's a deep philosophical question about education. Applying that question to the United States or to Britain today is, and I think it's your point, it's very far away from the admissions debate. It's not about how many people, however they define themselves, you have in your enrollment rates. Actually, what does it mean? What does education mean? What's it like? I like the points that Tim was making, about these questions, because some of them have these really important. We have to return to these important philosophical questions and debates. But that's what I meant about a new language, a new rhetoric, bold and sharp, and strange and unfamiliar. But if we take our eyes off it, we'll be in trouble.
Yes.
Yes, I just wanted to think the paper is interesting. Could you go back to your last slide?
Yes.
The two, where you, yeah. So the last 2 points there, the lever down what diversity is for, what we're trying to achieve with diversity. And both of those seem quite defensible, but I wonder if you would, if some other drivers for diversity are part of the university, would they be legitimate or not? For instance, the attempt to use diversity to attract other students. Now, we focus on a lot of very elite institutions, but quite a few Midwestern universities in particular try hard to attract international students.
Mhm.
And this is a big draw. But a lot of international students often don't require financial aid, some do. And this is a big draw for other students. If you look in their prospectus, they'll emphasize how we're not just a small town in Minnesota, Carlton, McAllister, let's say. They'll actually list the number of different countries
Yes.
they come from. Earlier, and to some extent even now, the kind of regional diversity we're talking about was quite a strong factor. I mean, it goes back to what I was a freshman at Stanford in 1965. I was told that what she get more students like you, because I came from a small town of England and went to a normal public school, and they were at that time seen as a regional heavyweight,
Yeah.
but wanted to up their reputation to be, to be an elite institution, the equivalent of the Ivies or something.
Yep.
So,
This question.
this is a marketing. Would you see that as legitimate to try and pull in students from other countries? Might have positive spillovers.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's happening at public universities, whether they like it or not. I mean, and part of the recruitment of international students, to your point, is one of financial precarity. So, University of Wisconsin, University of Washington, Michigan, for example, even very elite public universities have been under austerity measures now for decades, and that has really meant that their service as public institutions to specific states is really not being met. That they're not educating actually disproportionately members of their own state, or that it's becoming so competitive to be admitted into those universities because they're reliant on out-of-state tuition dollars, which are higher, or out of country tuition dollars as well. So there's a kind of byproduct that they can spin from that in terms of geographic pull or kind of cosmopolitan or international flair for public universities that are really in need of cash infusion. And McAllister is actually an interesting point because they pride themselves so much on a kind of cosmopolitan, international, multilingual campus environment. So I think that speaks to kind of the flexibility of diversity and how one might frame oneself as diverse in the absence of racial diversity, let's say, in a place like Minnesota. But to your point, I mean, the higher education system, according to economists, kind of nationalized in the early 2000s. That's when the Common Application was really taking off, and it was possible to apply. If you were in Boston, you could apply to schools in California or in Florida or in Washington State or in Colorado, right? That all of those opportunities were available to you. And the geographic diversity, I think, is one that is not seen with quite as much or isn't presented with so much emphasis. But certainly, I would bet you right now that if you go to Stanford's diversity statistics, they will say that we have students from every country in the United States. So that is certainly a marker. I do think they see it as legitimate. They market themselves.
Great. Last one. Because we're running out of
delay,
time.
but I've been listening and enjoying it. I was just wondering whether it's helpful to try to separate some of the themes that we've covered, and you kind of, in a sense, advised us to think about. And I sort of wrote down 4 or 5 different themes. One was it's a question of power.
Yeah.
I think that groups that feel excluded, rightly or wrongly, are fighting back. This is particularly my work in India, where the reservations in universities used to be 50%, and people were pretty angry about that. Then had a commission in 1981 for the other backward castes, and it went up to 65%. And now it's been moving up towards 75%. So that means 75% of university places are already ascribed to certain groups, which creates a kind of power backlash. And I think we're seeing some of that. I think there's obviously the politics of the moment, populism that David's talked about, the anti-world kind of feelings. And then I think what you've talked a lot about, which is about the process and the ambiguities and so on. There's the conceptual matters that are going, which are connected to all those things. And then finally, I think we mustn't underestimate the messaging. I feel kind of very strong. It's a very good book by Matthew Said about the value of diversity, benefits that any kind of diverse group working together use, particularly in problem solving. So that ought to be, if you like, a one argument. I think it's a one argument. And maybe, hopefully, this is just a kind of a backlash, maybe a decadal backlash, just be a backlash. But I think there's a lot of different processes going on, and we've kind of unlocked them.
No comment?
Well, I will just say this, that one way to maybe bring some of these together is, at least in the United States, the legal definition of diversity has become more and more narrow. So the slide's gone, but I mean, initially this started as a form of justice, right? And then it narrowed actually for a long time over the course of various Supreme Court decisions to this very narrow definition of an educational good. That was the sole purpose in which universities could justify using race-based affirmative action. So that has gotten, chipped away at over time. And now even the most recent Supreme Court decision has said that universities can attend to experiences that might be related to a racial identity. So it's even smaller now. And as the definition of diversity has narrowed, at least in this one respect with regard to race, the kind of plurality of diversity that we might be interested in has actually really expanded in terms of what other kinds of identities should be recognized, the much more international and cosmopolitan global nature of higher education. And that hasn't been accommodated because of how this kind of legal reduction of the term. So when I should say the plurality too of identities in terms of how demographic change has really shifted our understanding of classification. So thank you very much for raising those points. That actually was helpful in clarifying some things for me as well.
That's great. Thank you very much, David. Thank you, Sonia. It's been terrific. Thank you also for agreeing to present it, because you only arrived in January. And it seems like you've been here for a long time, the way that you presented your work. It's great that we're gonna have you next term as well. And we can continue the conversation. Really solid sociological analysis. That was great, and we learned a lot. I hope you benefited as well from the comments. And that's all. Thank you.